paper, I guess, and I go to a hippie type school where you can just write about your life a lot. So a lot of it is autobiographical, and I think those parts might be more interesting. So I'm going to open with this quote by a writer I like a lot that sort of sums up, let's sort of introduce what I'm writing about in my paper. In Against Ordinary Language, Language of the Body, Kathy Acker writes, "In our culture, we simultaneously fetishize and disdain the athlete, a worker in the body, for we still live under the sign of Descartes. The sign is also the sign of patriarchy. As long as we continue to regard the body, that which is subject to change, chance, and death, as disgusting and inimical, so long shall we continue to regard ourselves as dangerous others." So this section I'm reading from is Feminine Writing in the Search for an Authentic Voice. So my writing practice was born out of a search for authenticity and genuine self-expression, when for a long time a self often felt like an elusive thing. What drove me to write was what initially sometimes felt like voicelessness, a difficult relationship with expression that had never been synonymous with lack of thought. So I turned to ink and paper to cultivate an inner self, a private agency that could not be taken away, a confidence that could thrive inwardly when an outer self felt like a fraught and complicated thing. My notebook was where I could emerge and cultivate a subjectivity and transform my thinking. It was where I first learned to push beyond the comfortable boundaries of the ill-fitting truths that I had inherited. Writing was both a constructive and a deconstructive effort, undoing years of programming, the damage of both familial abuse and the lies and limitations of female socialization. It was a way of working to bridge the gap between my head and heart, a way to understand why my emotions didn't always line up with my convictions. I've always written with transformation or healing in mind, to reflect and make sense of what is sometimes seemingly senseless. I write because I believe in the transformative power of imaginative and introspective thought, and I believe that literature, that story, is an important empathetic tool. Any substantive change originates first and foremost in feeling, in emotion which resides in the body, in visceral glimpses of utopia, in the capacity to feel transported to a different reality. These are the roots of any sort of individual, societal, or cultural change. Thus, artists can be doing radical work that is getting to the root of things, even when that work is not overtly political. The writing that I gravitate to and seek to produce foregrounds the body and the unconscious. The body and the unconscious are linked, since imagination stems from the sensory. In Platonic philosophy, imagination occupies an intermediate rank in the hierarchy between sense perception and intellect, since it is tied to sense perception and the corporeal. Visionary imagination is grounded in the senses and in materiality. So, for example, the visionary texts of medieval women mystics were often disparaged because of their link to the body, which was seen as the antithesis of the spiritual. One of my favorite writers and theorists, Hélène Cixous, in 3 Steps on the Ladder of Writing, tells us that writing comes from the body, from somewhere deep inside. "It is deep in my body, further down, behind thought. Thought comes in front of it and closes like a door. This does not mean that it doesn't think, but it thinks differently from our thinking and speech. Somewhere in the depths of my heart, which is deeper than I think. Somewhere in my stomach, my womb, and if you haven't got a womb, then it is somewhere else. This sort of descent is much more difficult to achieve, much more tiring, much more physically exacting than climbing up. Perhaps this is why I am drawn to the fairy tale as form. I am drawn to its sensuousness as well as its origin as a body folktale, not yet sanitized of bodily reality. For me, the fairy tale as literary form lends itself well to exploring themes of female embodiment. In Fairy Tale as Art Form and Portrait of Man, folklorist Max Luthi shows that the fairy tale is essentially a humanistic genre, a reflection of the way human beings see themselves. Perhaps it is because I am at my core a humanistic writer interested in psychology and inner reality that I am so drawn to this form. To write is to be a thinking mind-body, as the writer Banu Kapil states. As someone who has spent many years working as an exotic dancer, a very obvious and literal worker in the body, I want to speak from this reviled place, to write from a place of bodily intelligence and embodied knowledge. In The Politics and Poetics of Transgression, Stalabras and Whitewright, A recurrent pattern emerges. The top attempts to reject and eliminate the bottom for reasons of prestige and status, only to discover not only is it in some way frequently dependent on that low other, but also that the top includes that low symbolically as a primary eroticized constituent of its own fantasy life. The years that I spent dancing had been a lifelong lesson on the dualistic nature of misogyny in our culture. I repeatedly learned the lesson that you cannot be both a mind and a body, and that if you are a sexualized female body, you cannot be viewed as a mind, or as yourself, a whole entity. I also learned a great deal about the vital role of fantasy and imagination, of the relationship between mass-mediated images and scripts, and the very real control that these have on people's psyches and desires, and the need to shatter these and to provide new images and new scripts. There are avant-garde writers, artists, and filmmakers who are doing this, but I also see the need for complexity and humanity in accessible narratives that people can understand without belonging to a cultural elite or having a lot of educational privilege. When I was dancing, I thought a lot about the pornography industry, the beauty industry, television and advertising in general, and about who generates these images and scripts, and my role as someone who played into some of these images in order to take monetary advantage. I was taking advantage of a less than ideal situation that I wasn't responsible for creating. I was falling back on what I had at my disposal. I was fashioning myself into a fiction that these men were conditioned to desire. However, while doing so, I had to momentarily give up authorship over myself and enter a place of meekness, to quietly fashion myself into a flat character, a caricature of femininity, to enact a caricature of sexuality. The beauty of literature, I think, is that it continuously pushes us to see and feel complexity, and trains us not to settle for easy answers or two-dimensional conceptions of people. I saw again and again that the cultural criticism I was reading was no abstraction. No matter how little they reflect reality, the popular narratives that people consume affect them intimately. They petrify their thinking into stereotypes and archetypes, which play out within their imaginations and bodies, within the most universal realms of daily existence, self-image, romance, and sexual desire. I also saw repeatedly how the female body was conceived of as akin to nature, at once reviled and desirable, or even healing because of its association with the untamable, with the wild, and with the dirty. It was at once abjected and compulsorily eroticized. No matter how often its natural state was reviled, fought, concealed, and augmented in these environments, I saw how for some, visits to the strip club were an antidote to the mind-numbing alienation of the 40-hour work week, an attempt to purchase a little magic, a little wildness, sometimes even a little romance, affection, or human connection. At the end of the night, though, you saw their faces sober and inevitably sink or grow angry with the returning awareness that what they purchased was just another simulated reality. In Hélène Cixous's work, I find an invaluable model for a non-essentialist ecofeminism and ecopoetics. In To Live the Orange, she writes, "There is a time for listening to the vibrations that things produce and detaching themselves from the nothing being to which our blindness relegates them. There is a time for letting things with indifference give themselves to be heard." Ecofeminism comes in many strains, some of which rely on essentialist notions of women and nature and seek to merely bolster the denigrated ends of Western dualisms, without questioning the ways in which the categories women and nature are formulated in the first place. However, what I am speaking of is an ecofeminism that seeks to undo objectification in all of its forms, that stands against the reduction of living beings to the status of mere objects, which enable their exploitation and abuse. To write as a thinking mind-body is to ally myself with matter, with the abject, not to speak for it. How does this occur in writing? There have been women writers who have called for the liberation of the thing itself, a foregrounding of the literal which the signifier refers to, a prioritizing of embodied reality over transcendence and abstraction. Virginia Woolf, Adrienne Rich, and Clarice Lispector are some examples, only some. It can be argued that these women writers conceive of the objective world as imbued with a spiritual presence, more of a you than an it. To foreground matter over abstraction is to write with the bravery that comes with writing from a vulnerable position. We dislike matter, that is, ourselves, because we are destined to matter, because anonymous matter is called death, Cixous wrote. Écriture féminine, or feminine writing, calls for a foregrounding of experience over signification. When women's bodies on the earth are both considered inert